this is part of a joint research project that we've been doing together. Myself, Elena, Dionysios, and Christina, and Elena and Christina are also here today with us. So, first of all, just a bit of basic terminology, because there's quite a bit of variation in the literature. So we're using the term indirect passive to refer to the well-known construction where the non-theme argument for ditransitive verbs, such as a recipient, becomes the subject of a passive sentence. So, for example, they gave me a book becomes I was given a book. And another term for this that's sometimes used is recipient passives, which, for example, is Alan's term. Now, the indirect passive construction is quite rare cross-linguistically, and arguably English and ancient Greek are among the few Indo-European languages to exhibit them. And our aim has been to compare these two languages. Thanks. As I was saying, our aim is to compare the two languages. Indirect passives develop in both English and Greek, and we want to track their development. And ultimately, they have distinct paths in English and Greek. They generalize in the former, but they get lost from the latter. And in today's talk, we're going to be focusing on A, and in particular, we're exploring how this phenomenon was first established and discussing similarities between the two languages in how it spread. And so first we're going to look at indirect passives in Greek and on some lexical and thematic restrictions on them, using the framework of verb classes based on our new corpus. And then we'll go on to look at indirect passives in English, not only previous accounts, but a new corpus study that we've begun to undertake. And we have a proposal for the emergence of indirect passives involving ambiguities in argument structure and polysemy. And we'll also discuss some cross-linguistic diachronic divergence, the role of prefixes and prefixed verbs, and preposition incorporation, which plays a role in Greek, but not in English. And then we'll conclude with a summary. So just to begin, in our previous work, such as Anagnostopoulou and Sevdali, 2015 and 2020, we focused on Greek because it can provide a window into the nature of the dative case. And our data, which cover quite a wide time span, as you'll see, are derived primarily from TLG, with additional material from papyri and inscriptions. And we've made an annotated corpus based on our data available at the website that you can see here. And in Greek, it's actually possible to see the emergence of indirect passives within the textual record. There's little or no attestation in Homer, but in the classical period, we begin to see some restricted use. And then there's a significant increase in post-classical and Hellenistic texts. But by the late medieval period, they go into a decline, and this construction has been lost from the grammar of modern Greek. So in our work on Greek ditransitives, which is Anagnostopoulou et al. Forthcoming, we propose a new type of classification of these verbs which combines syntactic and semantic criteria. And the passivizability of datives is one of the syntactic criteria that we use for classifying Greek ditransitives, because it's found consistently with some classes of verbs and not others. And what this system shows is that only dative arguments with certain theta rules can become the subject of passive constructions. So, for example, just to give you a brief overview of our classification for verbs that take an accusative argument and a dative argument, Passe is verbs like didomi, give, or tempo, send, where the dative rule can be described as a goal, and there are no indirect passives. For advise command verbs, such as paraneo, advise, or epitasso, and join, the dative rule is an affected addressee. We'll talk a bit more about that later. And with these, we do find indirect passives. Likewise, with entrust verbs, such as encherizo, entrust, or paracorello, seed, the dative rule is a recipient, and here we also see indirect passives. With comparison and mixing verbs, such as ape caso, compare, or make believe, mix, the dative rule is an instrument, and here once again there are no indirect passives. However, having an appropriate thematic rule isn't the only criterion to determine whether an indirect passive will appear. Even within any given class, there's considerable variation in which verbs form indirect passives, and you can see this in this selection, which is just drawn from the advised command verbs. And I should point out that the figures here refer to the archaic and classical periods only. For all these verbs, indirect passives do begin to be recorded in later texts. But you can see that at this period, only two of them form indirect passives, and that's epitasso and prostasso at the bottom. Diachronic comparison shows that the frequency of indirect passives increases in post-classical texts, so verbs such as menio, which didn't form indirect passives at an earlier stage, begin to develop them. And new verbs are also formed, such as écrire or tell, which also participate in these constructions. But nevertheless, considerable lexical variation persists, and you can see that in this period, enchiriazo, entrust, is very productive with indirect passives, but these other verbs, the indirect passives, are still relatively restricted, even though we have enough examples to show that they were at least grammatical. Now, Greek also has ditransitive verbs taking two accusative objects, and these allow passivization of the non-theme argument. The passives of this sort are more common cross-linguistically than those with accusative dative verbs. And it's sometimes stated, for example by Smythe, 1920, that for these verbs only the animate argument can become the subject of a passive, but in many cases we've found passivization of both arguments. And these can be divided into two classes, so where the non-theme role is a goal, as in didasco, teach, or telero, order, on source verbs, as in itel, request, or zetel, seek. And in these verbs we show variations similar to accusative dative verbs in the availability of different passive types. So for example, passivization of the non-theme argument is very common with ertao, ask, but not at all common with the semantically similar itel, request. And I should mention also at this point that Greek also has accusative genitive verbs, and with these verbs, the genitive argument can also become the subject of a passive, but unfortunately, there's time constraints, we won't be able to talk about those today. So as we've seen, there are some restrictions on indirect passives in Greek. Some theta rules passivize, but others don't. So we see indirect passives with affected addressees and recipients, but not with rules or commutatives or instruments. Another interesting factor, which we'll return to later, is that a majority of the Greek verbs forming indirect passives have prefixes. However, some unprefixed verbs do also form indirect passives, such as martyreo, testify, and many prefixed verbs never form indirect passives, such as anti-martyreo, contradict. And this is compatible with the analysis of Greek ditransitives, as assigning dative or genitive case via a PP, including a null P, which may be incorporated into the verb. And now we'll turn to indirect passives in English, and you'll see these bear quite striking similarities with what we've seen in the Greek data. Now, there are many generative accounts of indirect passives in English that have a synchronic focus. They explore questions of locality and how an indirect object can be allowed to move to the subject position. So, for example, Larson suggested that indirect passives were contingent on dative shift, and Harley suggested that there was an underlying difference between double object constructions with P have and prepositional constructions with P law. And some of these analyses are based on the idea that there's a fundamental asymmetry between the presence of a preposition in "it was given to me" and the lack of one in "I was given it." However, there are varieties of English that allow symmetrical passives, so both I was given it and it was given me. And these have been analyzed in certain ways by authors such as Haddocken, which may shed light on what we see in the syntax of Greek. Now, the first unambiguous examples of indirect passives in English are recorded from the late 14th century, as Allen established in her study in 1995. Most analyses of indirect passives in English make reference to the loss of case distinctions and other language-specific developments as a cause for their establishment. For example, Jesperson suggested that pre-verbal datives were analyzed as nominatives, and post-verbal datives were. It was suggested by Allen that post-verbal datives were reanalyzed as accusatives, and Stein et al. Have suggested that this was part of a broader change involving the replacement of lexical case by structural case. And many analyses, of course, make reference to the potential role of language contact, for example, with French. However, very few of these are language-specific factors are applicable to Greek, and yet both of these languages display considerable similarities in their indirect passives. So, for example, Greek has very clear examples of lexical case, such as theta-related case and monotransitives. For example, in example 3, you can see that the verb oethel, help, assigns a dative case. And Greek case marking is morphologically unambiguous throughout the relevant period. So example 4 shows that the dative autois and the accusative erga have very different morphological realizations of their respective cases, and that the case marking is preserved in the indirect passives that we see in 5. Also, most analyses of the indirect passive in English propose a parametric type of change which would be expected to affect all verbs in the lexicon of a given speaker, but this is problematic given that indirect passives are known to have diffused very slowly through the lexicon, with acceptability varying widely among different verbs. So, for example, Allen first observed that most early examples of indirect passives occur with verbs borrowed from French, and the gradual diffusion of indirect passives through the lexicon, beginning with these French verbs, was described by Stein et al. And even as recently as 1927, we see Jesperson questioning the acceptability of examples such as "he was written a letter." And this graph is just based on the data from Stein et al., and it shows some of the ways that it shows the length of time it took for these indirect passives to spread through the lexicon. You can see that even at the latest period, beginning in 1600, there were only a small number of lexemes involved, less than 35. And I should say that due to some methodological differences between their study and ours, in some cases, our figures, which we'll be discussing later, will be slightly different. So earlier we were looking at the classification system we've used for Greek verbs, but there are fewer obvious class divisions among English verbs than in Greek because of the lack of open case distinction and the greater use of prepositions for many thematic rules. For example, in English, instruments are always expressed by with or through or a similar preposition rather than with a bare dative. However, we've used the classification system proposed by Levin to give some indication of how the availability of indirect passives cuts across other syntactic and semantic criteria. So, our study has drawn some English data from the past corpus of early English correspondence, and this corpus covers the period from the early 15th to late 17th centuries, which Stein et al. Have identified as a time of significant growth in the productivity of these indirect passives. And I should emphasize that these are preliminary data, and we hope to extend this to a wider number of lexemes to produce a more balanced picture. And what we've done is we've done an exhaustive search in the corpus for all forms of each of these lexemes within the relevant period, and then classified them in terms of their voice properties. Now, the verbs marked in green are the ones with clear parallels in Greek, and you can see how few of these are. So, for example, in English, we see indirect passives with verbs meaning promise, which we don't see in Greek, but on the other hand, in Greek we see indirect passives for parallelism, which means advise, whereas advise in English doesn't form indirect passives. And you can also see the considerable lexical variability. So, for example, in forms nearly 50% of its examples of any sort as indirect passives, but similar words such as command form a much lower proportion of their recorded tokens as indirect passives. And you can see that this variability exists within any given class. And this variation in the productivity of indirect passives, which we've seen for late Middle English and early modern English, is very similar to what we've seen in Greek. And lexical gaps exist even with verbs of the same stratum and semantic class. For example, we see that attestations of sentences such as "he has been allowed one" or "I have been promised a sight of it," but never anything like "I have been granted this." And there's one striking lexical gap that's common to both languages. So the only indirect passives of give in ACC involve constructions of the type "I was given to understand this," and in Greek, no clear indirect passives of didymi, meaning give, have ever been identified at all. And the fact that lexical restrictions of indirect passives have persisted for such a long period of time in both English and Greek supports the idea that there might be a common basis for the analysis of indirect passives in both languages, despite some of the individual differences in the manifestation of this phenomenon. So the question then arises of how we can account for the emergence of indirect passives for the lexical variability that we've seen and the slow diffusion throughout the lexicon in both English and Greek. One starting point for this is that in both English and Greek, indirect passives first appear among verbs with considerable variability or ambiguity in their argument structure. So, polysemous verbs have been argued to have relatively unspecified roots which are compatible in multiple frames so that their meaning is fixed in context, and several different versions of this have been proposed in the literature. And crucially, in Greek, they're compatible with multiple case frames. And our hypothesis is that dative passivization always starts from a misanalysis of accusative passivization, which is only possible in principle with verbs that allow multiple case arrays for direct and indirect objects. And likewise, in English, we hypothesize that certain syntactic structures favoring case alternations favor this sort of reanalysis by learners in such a way that the promoted subject is come to see as corresponding to an original indirect object. So in this way, indirect passives may originate in the convergence of multiple independent forms of reanalysis along separate paths. But if this sort of reanalysis only took place for one or two verbs, it might affect only those verbs, but eventually it has the potential to reach a point where it is seen as a productive construction for the language in general.
You have about 5 minutes.
Oh, thanks. So, for example, the Greek verb tasso and its compounds were among the first to show the productive formation of indirect passives. Tasso is a polysemous verb with a very wide range of senses, including arrange, station, appoint, assign, command, and quite a lot of others that are listed in lexicons. And animate arguments occupy a variety of morphosyntactic and semantic roles, including accusative patients and dative recipients. For example, in the sense order, tasso was normally construed with a dative addressee controlling an infinitive. So you can see in example 9, Ekastoi etaxan decan in peltastas proselestai. They ordered each to choose 10 peltasts. Ekastoi each is in the dative, and it also controls the infinitive proselestai. However, there was a rare alternative to this construction with accusative and infinitive, as in this example, sen in taxo philasen, I shall order you to guard him. Originally, the accusative was just the subject of the infinitive, and it would have meant I shall order that you guard him, but speakers may have reanalyzed this as an addressee, as in the dative construction. And so when we see arguments such as becoming the subject of passive constructions, they were originally just passivized subjects of infinitives, but once they were reanalyzed as passivized addressees, this could extend to the dative construction as well. And likewise, in English, we see considerable variability in argument structure in many of the first English verbs to form indirect passives, such as ask. It's possible to ask something of someone, ask someone of something, ask something for someone, or ask someone for something. And some of the English indirect passives are, as we mentioned, are derived from structures that are potentially opaque in the same way as the tasso constructions. And I mentioned earlier that one of the earliest constructions where we see passives of give is I was given to understand this. So in the active, a sentence such as they gave me to understand this originally meant they gave me this in order for me to understand it. But it's quite possible that it was reanalyzed as meaning they caused me to understand this, in which case the animate argument is no longer an indirect object. And passives such as I was given to understand this may originally have been produced by speakers who had the latter interpretation, but speakers who understood the active in the formal sense would have reanalyzed them as indirect passives and used them as a model to produce unambiguous indirect passives such as I was given a book. Affectedness may also play a role. Direct objects are prototypically affected as being themes, and the first indirect objects that passivize also show high affectedness and are thus semantically closer to the direct object themes. And this may be why we see passives for inform appearing earlier in English than advise, because in inform the indirect object is affected as acquiring information, but advice doesn't necessarily have any effect on the person advised. And the verbs least susceptible to this sort of reanalysis would thus be prototypical ditransitives such as give, which always have an accusative inanimate theme, dative animate recipient, or at least almost always. And our hypothesis is that in English and Greek these ambiguities were sufficient to reach some critical point, but many languages such as Latin which lacked indirect passives may have had fewer argument alternations, or there may have been other independent properties of the grammar, such as the availability of dependent or lexical or prepositional datives. And later on, of course, we see cross-linguistic divergence. In English, the indirect passive was extended to all verbs taking two non-prepositional objects, and this development may have been relatively late as the 20th century. In Greek, a greater degree of lexical restriction seems to have persisted until these constructions were eventually lost. And as we mentioned, in Greek there's a correlation between indirect passives and prefixes, but in English many of the earliest verbs to form indirect passives are unprefixed, such as ask, or have synchronically opaque prefixes, such as allow, and nor have we found any correlation between indirect passives and particle constructions. And likewise, Greek lacks the English pseudo-passive, as in he was spoken to. These divergences suggest that there may be some syntactic differences between English and Greek in their underlying structures, for example, whether or not they involve P incorporation, but further work is needed to determine the exact nature of this. So just to conclude, the typologically rare indirect passive construction arose in both English and Greek, and in Greek and in earlier English, lexical variation exists in its availability. Indirect passives are restricted to arguments with an appropriate thematic rule. However, these semantic criteria are not sufficient in themselves to predict which verbs form indirect passives. And these constructions may have had their origin in the analysis of ambiguous constructions of verbs with variable argument structures. From this common starting point, indirect passives follow different paths in English and Greek. Thank you.